Okay, Cliff Connor is a historian of science and a biographer of revolutionaries. He was educated as an engineer, and he has a doctorate from CUNY Graduate Center, where he taught the history of science. Among the books he has written include a People's History of Science, 2 biographies of the French revolutionary and scientist Jean-Paul Marat, as well as biographies of several Irish revolutionary leaders. His talk today is going to be on his latest book, The Tragedy of American Science from the Cold War to the Forever Wars. He'll explain the contents of the book, but it should be clear from, I think, the general idea should be clear from the title that big science has been irredeemably corrupted by big money, threatening the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the medicines we take. And with that, take it away, Cliff. Oh, also, I will, one other thing. I will put a link in the chat for how to order the book. The book is published by Haymarket, a prominent radical progressive book publisher. And you can order it on the link, which I'm going to put in the chat now. Okay, Cliff.
Okay, thank you. I am unmuted, I trust, and you're hearing me. Thanks for that introduction, Bob, and thanks to the Deerfield Progressive Forum for inviting me to talk about the book here today. I'll begin by sharing the screen here. Let me know if everybody sees it. Is that okay? Of course, oh, I see a thumbs up. Everybody's muted. Okay, so let me begin by deconstructing the title of the book, This Tragedy of American Science. First of all, why does the title include the word American? I don't want anybody to get the mistaken impression that I'm only concerned with the problems of the 4 or 5% of the world's population that lives in the United States. But science in this country happens to dominate world science, so the tragedy I'm describing has worldwide implications and consequences. And I'm putting the focus on US science because that's where blame for the tragedy should primarily be directed. What about the word science? Some people think of science as only including physics, chemistry, and biology. But in this book, it applies to all fields of scientific inquiry, including the social sciences like economics and political science, and the behavioral sciences. The original subtitle of the book was From Truman to Trump, and it was intended to indicate the time frame of the book, from the end of World War II up to the present day. But now Trump is yesterday's news, so the publisher Haymarket Books is going to change the subtitle when the updated edition comes out in June. From Truman to Trump is going to be changed to From the Cold War to the Forever Wars, which is the title, subtitle that Bob used a minute ago. You've heard the phrase, the Republican war on science. That goes way back before Trump came on the scene, but it's misleading because the anti-science campaigns like climate change denial are funded by bipartisan corporate money. The most obvious example, of course, is the fossil fuel industry. If you think the Democratic Party isn't under the influence of fossil fuel corporations, I have 2 words for you, Joe Manchin, and he's just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. More recently, the problem has been rebranded as Trump's war on science, but the tragedy of American science didn't begin with Donald Trump. He made the problems more obvious and made them worse, but they really began right after World War II, when American policymakers decided to launch the Cold War. That's why Truman's name was in the original subtitle of the book, From Truman to Trump. If you want a symbolic icon to represent the beginning of the tragedy of American science, you can think of the mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were ordered by Truman. The movement that Trump launched is still dangerous, even though he was, we could call him yesterday's news. The threat of a Trump-inspired right-wing dictatorship in the United States is still on the table, and it isn't negligible. After all, more than 74 million Americans cast their votes last year for a sociopathic demagogue who then collaborated with ultra-right-wing organizations to mobilize an armed mob to prevent his removal from office. One commentator predicted that the return of Trump to the White House would soon lead to the Pinochetization of the United States. I think it would be foolish to
get muted because I'm going to mute you first of all, so we don't interrupt the meeting.
One commentator predicted that the return of Trump to the White House would soon lead to the Pinochetization of the United States. And I think it would be foolish to discount that possibility. So there's one more word in the title to discuss, and that's tragedy. What is the tragedy of contemporary science? The tragedy is that science today isn't what it's supposed to be, and it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It's been put to negative purposes and hasn't been used to accomplish all the wondrous things we all know it could have accomplished. Let's make a quick inventory of what American science has actually brought us since World War II. First, we have a gigantic arsenal of thermonuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert, threatening to blow up the world. And 8 other countries now also have nuclear arsenals of their own. It's not an exaggeration to say that a nuclear war could kill all human life on Earth. That's anthropogenic existential crisis number 1. Second, we're faced with an existential environmental climate crisis that we can't solve because we're being held hostage by the fossil fuels industries. Third, we have gigantic factory farms churning out pandemics like COVID-19 as their necessary byproducts. That presents the danger of a perfect storm pandemic that could threaten the further existence of the human race. I could go on, but those 3 existential crises will do for starters. But the greatest tragedy of American science, some commentators have said, and I tend to agree, is the path not taken. What might have been accomplished if the many trillions of dollars and the enormous amount of scientific talent wasted on military R&D had instead been devoted to finding solutions to the crucial problems facing the human race today: poverty, hunger, disease, and environmental devastation. If that's not a tragedy, I don't know what the word means. Meanwhile, the public discourse has been degraded and dragged into anti-science and irrationalism with such things as climate change denial, anti-Darwinism, anti-vaxism, and many, many more absurdities. You might call it the muddling of the American mind. And of course, it spread way beyond the United States. This photo, for example, was from Australia. And although all of this began well before Trump came on the scene, his administration brought it to new heights of irrationalism and have become considerably more aggressive and dangerous. Most progressive-minded people were hoping that Trump's departure from the White House would bring a turn for the better, but a return to pre-Trump normality would still leave us way short of resolving the tragedy of science that I'm describing in this book. That takes care of the words in the title. Now onto the book itself. I can summarize its message succinctly in 2 words: corporatization and militarization. The tragedy of contemporary science is that it has been primarily used to serve the interests of corporate profits and war. I found a perfect epigraph for the book by the eminent literary critic Terry Eagleton, and it sums up the book in 2 sentences. I'll read them, and it's the 2 here that are highlighted. The language of enlightenment has been hijacked in the name of corporate greed, the police state, a politically compromised science, and a permanent war economy. Scientific rationality and freedom of inquiry have been harnessed to the ends of commercial profit and weapons of war. That really hits the target, and the book that I'm talking about now is a 300-page elaboration of those themes. Most people believe that science and technology should be used for the benefit of humanity, to make life better for the billions of people who populate the planet. But in the United States today, science and technology have been corrupted to drive ever-growing economic inequality and war, and that is supremely tragic. It hasn't always been that way. At the end of World War II, expectations of what science and technology could accomplish in peacetime were virtually unlimited. Disease would be conquered, world hunger would be eliminated, new industries and inventions would create global prosperity, and the rockets that had carried German bombs would instead extend human exploration to the moon and beyond. Now, 75 years later, people look back and wonder what happened to that dream. Well, that's exactly the historical question I set out to answer. Where did everything start going downhill? I see the root of the problem in the Cold War, which is usually thought of as a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was that, of course, but it didn't begin like that. It didn't begin as two sides in struggle against each other. It began with the United States unilaterally breaking its wartime alliance with the Soviet Union and treating its former ally as an absolute, irreconcilable enemy. We all know that Joseph Stalin was one of history's most brutal dictators with no redeeming qualities. But the point I'm trying to make now is that it wasn't Stalin who wanted a Cold War or any kind of war with the United States. He wanted a permanent arrangement that would let him run his part of the world and let the United States run its part of the world. So the Soviet Union didn't start the Cold War. It was American policymakers who insisted on demonizing the Soviet Union and instilling fear and paranoia in the American population. And that was the origin of most of our current social problems, including the tragedy of contemporary science. Cold War paranoia about a non-existent Soviet threat was the rationale for devoting an absolutely absurd proportion of our national resources, including our scientific resources, to creating ultra-high-tech weapons of war. But now let's go back and consider the two keywords, corporatization and militarization, one at a time. First, what's the fundamental problem with the corporatization of science? Corporatization has corrupted science and made it untrustworthy. Another way to say corporatization is privatization. The ideal of science has always been expressed in the phrase, science in the public interest. But what we really have today is science in the private interest. And I consider that to be an oxymoron, a pure contradiction in terms. Any research that's done in the private interest is manipulated research. It doesn't deserve to be called science at all. And that includes all of the research done directly by corporations or funded by corporations, which is to say, the vast majority of research done in the world today. About half of the book discusses the corruption of science due to its domination by corporate interests. The classic ideal of science is that it's supposed to be unbiased investigation and not a way of proving something that investors want you to prove. If most of the research in the United States is devoted to increasing corporate profits, which it is, that's what I mean when I say that American science has been corrupted to drive economic inequality. One of the worst examples of corporate science was the decades of tobacco studies that aimed to prove that cigarettes don't cause cancer, that smoking doesn't kill people, and that nicotine is not addictive. And more recently, there was a scandal of pain management science that was corrupted to favor the marketing of addictive opioids that have killed hundreds of thousands of people. And of course, there's the whole absurdity of the scientific pretensions of climate change denial. Most rational people, I think, are by now well aware of the extreme and imminent danger of environmental catastrophe that we're faced with. Rising levels of greenhouse gases caused by burning fossil fuels are raising the Earth's temperatures to levels that will soon make the planet uninhabitable, at least for human beings. The only way that can be avoided is to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. Science and technology have already provided theoretical solutions as to how that can be done by developing renewable energy sources that do away with the need for fossil fuels. And yet those solutions aren't being adequately developed and implemented, and we are collectively kicking the can down the road to certain destruction. The problem is not scientific, it's political. The policymakers who make the decisions for our whole society are beholden to billionaire investors who own the fossil fuels industries. Those are trillion-dollar industries. The global oil market is worth about $1.7 trillion a year, and the coal industry is also valued at more than $1 trillion. Those investors don't want to lose trillions of dollars of their wealth, obviously. But that's not our problem. If we can't overcome the political obstacle the billionaires that own the fossil fuels industries represent, we're all doomed. So now let's consider the other tragic aspect of American science, militarization. Militarization has directed science away from its promise as the engine of human progress, and instead uses it to create the technology of massive death and endless war. You might say that instead of improving the means of production, it creates the means of destruction. In my opinion, this is the most tragic aspect of contemporary science. Most people, I think, expect or at least hope that our scientific institutions will devote their efforts to producing knowledge that will benefit the human race. But unfortunately, the trillions of dollars the American government spends in the name of science are primarily devoted to perfecting military technologies of death, finding new and better ways to kill people in large numbers, from thermonuclear bombs to robot drones, cluster munitions, and anti-personnel weaponry of seemingly infinite variety. At a congressional budget hearing a couple of years ago, former US Secretary of War James Mad Dog Mattis gave an unusually frank answer when he was asked why the military needed those hundreds of billions of dollars. And he said, "I need to make the military more lethal." It may sound exaggerated when I say trillions of dollars are devoted to military research, but that's based on official government accounting that actually understates the real size of the expenditures. And I also cite evidence in the book to support the claim that more than half of the federal science budget goes to the military. Almost everybody's aware of the absurdity of the size of the military budget, and yet in the realm of the public discourse, very little discussion is devoted to seriously dealing with that problem. Just a few years after World War II, when the military contractors were just beginning to create a permanent war economy in the United States, President Dwight D. Eisenhower coined the famous phrase military-industrial complex and warned of the dangers it represented. And everybody still uses that phrase, but the discussion never really went any further. And the military-industrial complex continued its unrestrained, out of control growth. I know you're all familiar with the metaphor of the elephant in the room, the thing that's always there looming over us, and everybody's aware of it, but nobody has much to say about it. Well, that's pretty much how the military budget is treated in the so-called national conversation in the United States. People complain about it from time to time, but don't really seem to grasp the enormity of it. Try to imagine a literal elephant in the room. You go to a friend's apartment and there's a 10,000-pound African elephant sitting there in the living room, taking up most of the space. So you ask your friend, why? Why is this elephant here? What is its purpose? Is it contributing something you need? But your friend says, no, I don't know why it's here. I can't get it to leave, but I'm used to it now because it's been there as long as I can remember. And then you'd ask, well, do you have to feed it? And your friend says, yes, and it's really expensive. It takes 2/3 of my paycheck to feed that damn thing. And you'd say, well, that's just ridiculous. It blows my mind to think anybody would put up with that and not try to find a way to get that elephant out of here. And you'd be right. That's a perfect metaphor for what the military budget represents in the United States. We're allowing the people who run this country to devote a gigantic, immense, absurd proportion of our national resources to war and weapons. And as I said, this doesn't figure very much at all in the public discourse. The US Congress, which is controlled by Democrats, just a few months ago voted overwhelmingly to approve a military budget for this year of $777.7 billion. Not only was that $37 billion more than Trump's final budget, it gave the Pentagon $25 billion more than Biden himself had requested. This bipartisan, obsequious capitulation to the military-industrial complex was so skillfully downplayed by the news media that it slipped through with hardly a ripple of public response. That means, if you think about it, with regard to this issue, which is certainly one that deeply impacts the lives of all of us and of billions of people all over the world, it doesn't really matter whether the Democrats or Republicans are in control of the US government, because on this issue, both parties are going to vote to give ever more hundreds of billions of dollars to the military. And that $777 billion isn't the whole story. Those figures don't include all military spending. This chart shows the difference between how military spending is portrayed in ordinary political discourse and how it should be portrayed if all of the money spent on war and weapons were accounted for. The green base of the chart represents what is usually called the military budget. That's what this year is supposed to be $777 billion. But the layers on top of the green base represent the budgets of militarized agencies like NASA, Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, and others that aren't typically included as part of the military budget. But most of all, that big yellow layer on the top of the chart represents the interest on the part of the national debt that was incurred by past military spending. And that certainly should be included, but it isn't. So if you add all that in, the military share of the total budget rises from half to 2/3. And the absolute amount they're planning to spend on war this year increases from $777 billion to way more than $1 trillion. If you break that down, it's about $4 billion every day that the United States is spending on past, present, and future wars. Now, why is this? The standard answer from the generals and the politicians and the policymakers is that all that money is necessary for national defense, but that simply is not true. In the book, I explain that it's because of the stranglehold of weaponized Keynesianism on the American economy. I won't say any more about that now, but if you want to, we can discuss that. We can discuss weaponized Keynesianism in the question and answer period. The most obvious difference between the world as it is today in 2022 and the way it was before 2020, when I was writing this book, is the pandemic. I actually finished the book and had submitted the manuscript to the publisher to publish it just before COVID-19 arrived on the world scene. But the pandemic's implications for science and public policy were so obvious that the publisher asked me to add an epilogue on the subject, which I was happy to do. The COVID-19 pandemic represents a new stage of the tragedy of American science. it has elevated the tragedy onto an even higher plane. It's a global pandemic, of course, but the way that it's played out in the United States has been especially tragic, both in the Trump administration's blatant disregard and even hostility to scientific reason, and in its epidemiological consequences as measured in comparative infection rates and hospitalization rates and death rates. You've heard of the so-called science wars, the public disputes over science policy. Well, those battles have really become sharper and fiercer since the onset of the pandemic. On the one hand, we had 4 years of asinine pronouncements of an administration that obviously couldn't have given less of a damn about public health. And on the other hand, were the people who actually knew what they were talking about, the epidemiologists, the virologists, other infectious disease experts, and the public health experts. Some of them, like the now famous Dr. Fauci, have attained iconic status in the eyes of a large part of the general public. But at the same time, on the local level, many public health officials are reporting that they've been harassed with death threats from Trump's right-wing base, even after Trump retreated to Mar-a-Lago. So that's a stark indicator of how much more serious and how much more bitter the science wars have become in the COVID era. I don't think I have to say any more about the pathetic actions and inaction of the Trump administration. By now, everybody should be aware of how they dismantled all the early warning systems that could have alerted us well in advance of the pandemic, and also how they weakened the federal regulatory agencies charged with oversight of scientific affairs, the CDC, the EPA, the FDA, and others, first by slashing their budgets, and then by manipulating them for partisan political advantage. Has the Biden administration, more than 1 year in, been any better? Well, that's an incredibly low bar. But with regard to public health policy and measures to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll choose my words carefully here. With regard to public health policy, Biden has clearly been less outrageously irresponsible than his predecessor. But on other fundamental issues, Biden's election represented a major step closer to global tragedy on multiple fronts. As previously noted, in his first months in office, Biden accelerated the militarization of American science and society, and his unshakable loyalty to the fossil fuels industry draws us ever nearer to the climate catastrophe point of no return. The Biden administration, this is from a report on a CNBC broadcast last November. The Biden administration has approved 3,091, no, I'm sorry, that's a typo. No, it isn't a typo, I'm sorry, I take it back. The Biden administration has approved 3,091 new drilling permits on public lands at a rate of 332 per month, a faster pace than the Trump administration's 300 permits per month. Furthermore, his administration recently opened more than 80 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico to auction for oil and gas drilling, a record offshore sale that will lock in years of greenhouse gas emissions. So, is the world better with Biden than if Trump had won re-election? Although a case can be made that a second Trump term could have resulted in a rapid Pinochetization of the United States, the answer nonetheless is no. In the final analysis, the crises of public health and the environment and economic inequality and racism are systemic, and no business as usual administration like Biden's is going to fundamentally challenge that. The bottom line is that with Biden, no less than with Trump, the planet Earth is precipitously hurtling toward existential catastrophe. I want to make one more point about the pandemic. When the first edition of this book came off the presses in August 2020, COVID-19 had claimed fewer than 170,000 lives in the United States. Now the death toll has surpassed 950,000. Worldwide, it has killed 6 million people, and those are official numbers, which are almost certainly underestimates. Meanwhile, a number of vaccines have been produced to contain the disease and limit its damage, but there's a problem. Once again, the problem is not a scientific one, but a political one. In the interests of public health, it would be best if almost everybody were vaccinated, but unfortunately, a significant minority of the population has been misled by an organized campaign of doubt and disinformation about the vaccines. That's a photo from the recent Ottawa so-called truckers' protests about having to take the vaccine, or about vaccine mandates. In my opinion, the anti-vax message is purely a bad faith argument, but it's been effective because it plays on the public's justified distrust of Big Pharma, the international pharmaceutical industry, which has produced most of the vaccines. So that raises a question that needs to be addressed. In the book, I wrote that science produced by corporations, which certainly include Big Pharma, is corrupted by financial conflicts of interest. So if Pfizer or Moderna says our vaccine is safe and effective, why should anybody trust them? Fortunately, we don't have to trust them. The verification of the vaccine's safety and effectiveness is not up to them. It's not in their hands. The verification process goes way beyond the mandatory clinical trials that the vaccines undergo. We now have public health data on the safety and efficacy of the vaccines based on the results of the literally billions of doses already administered. The accuracy of the public health statistics can be trusted because public interest organizations and investigative journalists all over the world keep a close eye on them. The science underlying the COVID-19 vaccines, including the use of mRNA technology in vaccines, is undeniably impressive and commendable. The big pharma corporations hire the most capable scientists they can find to create the vaccines. Those researchers give Big Pharma the ability to accomplish remarkable scientific feats when it wants to. But there's the catch. It has to want to. And the only thing that can make Big Pharma want to produce those vaccines is the prospect of material rewards in the form of supersized profits. That was the point of the Trump administration's Operation Warp Speed. Billions of dollars were paid out to the elite Big Pharma firms like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, as well as venture capitalist startups like Moderna, Vaxart, and Novavax that had never previously brought any vaccine to market. Operation Warp Speed was hyped as a scientific race for a vaccine among competing research laboratories. But in fact, it was a speculative financial frenzy among competing hedge funds. It took a massive infusion of government money, not private capital, to incentivize the research and development of several viable vaccines. But private investors have been allowed to reap the financial rewards, the extent of which has been deliberately hidden from public view by allowing the Warp Speed profiteers to bypass traditional federal contracting rules and regulatory oversight. Even a partial accounting, however, provides insight into the inequitable nature of the process. You probably won't recognize that face, but that's Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock Investments, the world's largest asset manager with $10 trillion in assets under management as of January 2022. Moderna's vaccine, like the others, was developed with the scientific and financial support of the federal government. Scientists at the National Institutes of Health contributed substantially to Moderna's success. Federal dollars financed Moderna's clinical trials and other research to the amount of at least $1.3 billion. And to top it off, the government guaranteed Moderna a $1.5 billion market for what was at the time still an unproven product. Those billions were simply the initial ante. Moderna and Pfizer together locked in guaranteed COVID vaccine sales of more than $60 billion for 2021 and 2022. Furthermore, analysts forecast 2023 revenue of more than $7.6 billion for Moderna and project the annual market eventually settling at around $5 billion or more. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there is no good reason, no material reason for channeling all that money through private corporations. If the pandemic was a wartime emergency, as we were repeatedly told it was, why didn't the United States do what it did in World War II with the Manhattan Project and produce the vaccines in national laboratories? The Manhattan Project demonstrated that private investment is not essential to scientific innovation or to production. The Trump and Biden administrations, by contrast, allowed private investors to organize and control the vaccine research and production and to become fabulously wealthy by taking all of the profits for themselves. A more rational and equitable approach would be to cut private investment out of the picture entirely by nationalizing big pharma. Is that idea an impossible utopian proposal? The remarkable achievements of Cuban biomedical science demonstrate that it is not utopian at all. Despite Cuba's relatively modest economic status, the country has been able to mobilize its scientific and financial resources to create and produce several safe, effective COVID vaccines. Cuba was the first country to immunize its entire population against COVID-19 with its own vaccines. And in sharp contrast to Big Pharma's relative neglect of poorer countries, Cuba plans to share its vaccines with other countries, including Iran, Vietnam, Mexico, Jamaica, and Argentina, to name just a few. The mention of Cuban medical science leads into the way that I want to conclude this presentation by considering how the tragedy of contemporary science might be resolved. Is there any real hope? Is it possible to resolve this tragedy? That's the multi-trillion-dollar question. And the answer is that I do see some grounds for hope. I've already alluded to the encouraging example of what Cuba, a very small country with very limited resources, has been able to accomplish in the realm of medical science. What Cuba has going for it is that it isn't burdened with an economic system geared only toward increasing the profits of private corporations. Because of that, it's been able to develop a science for human needs rather than science for profits. And it's been extremely successful in doing so. Cuban biotechnology and biomedical science have risen to the forefront of international science. So we have to ask, if Cuban science has done so much with so little, what marvels could the mighty engine of American science achieve? I'll repeat what I said earlier. Just imagine what American science might have accomplished if the many trillions of dollars wasted on weapons and war had instead been devoted to finding solutions to disease, hunger, poverty, and the climate crisis. But resolving the tragedy of American science isn't something that can happen in isolation from everything else that's going in the world. It can only be solved in conjunction with solving the overarching social problem of extreme economic inequality. The COVID crisis revealed that those people designated as essential workers and required to risk their lives to do their jobs were among the lowest paid members of our society: slaughterhouse workers, nursing home caregivers, people who stock the shelves in grocery stores, among many others. At the same time, some members of our society were exposed as non-essential: CEOs, financiers, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists, to name a few. Their main concern during the economic meltdown was to protect their own investments. And because of that, during the pandemic, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and 5 other big tech tycoons added $360 billion more to the billions they already had. All told, the oligarchic elite of the United States saw its wealth increase during the pandemic by $1.1 trillion at the same time the country as a whole was experiencing the sharpest rate in our poverty rate, the sharpest rise in our poverty rate in more than 50 years. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and just end by saying that after 2 centuries of mind-boggling scientific and technological progress, a few thousand billionaires control most of the Earth's resources, while billions of people remain mired in hunger, disease, oppression, and grinding poverty. Solve that problem, and resolving the tragedy of science will be a piece of cake. So the conclusion of this book has not changed in the 2 years that have passed since its original publication. The tragedy of American science, and by extension, the tragedy of human society on the planetary scale, has only worsened. I repeat the conclusion, and I'm quoting from the last page of the book. The need to replace the global economic system that serves private interests with one that serves the public interest is more urgent than ever. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot for your talk. We would, if this were an in-person meeting, we would now have a 15-minute break now, but we haven't been doing that for the Zooms. Anybody who wants to ask a question should raise their hand by pressing Alt-Y on the PC or Opt-Y on a Mac, and you'll raise your hand, and then I could call on you. And then don't forget, all you have to do is while you're talking, hold the space bar down the whole time that you're talking, and you'll be unmuted, and then you will mute again when you, and yes?
Oh, Richard, yeah, I just would, one more thing real quickly, going back to this screen sharing. The organizers of the Deerfield Progressive Forum asked me to tell you how you can get a copy of the book I've been talking about. So this slide shows that if you want a copy of the book, one good way to order it is directly from the publisher. Bob Schwartz earlier mentioned that in the Zoom chat, he posted a link, and you can click on that link that should be posted there. Or alternatively, you can just Google Haymarket Books or go to the Haymarket website, haymarketbooks.org, and search for Tragedy of American Science. Then you have to decide whether you want to get the original 2020 edition or whether you'd rather wait for the updated 2022 edition, but that won't be available until June. If you prefer to wait for the newer edition, you can submit a pre-order and it'll be shipped to you as soon as it comes off the press. So let me stop sharing the screen again and go back to Richard.
Okay, so this, don't everybody speak up at once.
No break.
No break. So, oh yeah, oh, okay, Sarah. Sarah, you're
Yes.
first.
You able to hear me? I have
Yes.
the, Okay, thank you, Cliff, for your wonderful work. I bought several copies of your book and given them to friends. One question, it's easy to say no war, but goodness gracious, if we just do peace, other people will trample us, like now with the Ukraine situation, as horrible as that is. And secondly, for doctors and health, the best thing that I can do as an individual is stay healthy, stay away from a lot of extra medications, eat vegetables and fruits and whole grains, and that'll go a long way. So I'll stop. Thank you, Cliff.
Okay, I'm not muted, am I?
No,
Shall I go ahead?
yes.
Okay, Sarah, I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine. Of course, that's on everybody's mind. First of all, I want to say that I unconditionally support the right of the Ukrainian people to national self-determination, and the Russian invasion is a clear violation of that right. When Vladimir Putin says that Russians have always seen Ukraine as part of Russia, he isn't making that up. Russian nationalists have always denied that Ukrainians are a separate nation, but that isn't what matters. What matters is how the Ukrainian people feel about that, and they clearly consider themselves a separate nation with a right to self-determination. But the question confronting us as Americans is, do the Biden administration's moves to militarily oppose the Russian invasion deserve our support? And I don't think so. I have an unbroken line of anti-war activity going back to the Vietnam War. The military record of the United States ever since the end of World War II has been 100% directed against the self-determination of small nations, from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. And you can be sure that any American military intervention in the current Ukrainian crisis is not to give the Ukrainians independence, but to get it into the American sphere and the NATO sphere. The American military is not designed to support human rights throughout the world. It's designed as an imperialist force to control the world. American policymakers see the Chinese and Russians as their primary military rivals, and Ukraine is simply a pawn in their geopolitical strategy. They have no more interest in Ukrainian independence than the Russians do, and that should be pretty obvious to. Looking at the faces on the screen, I think most of you, as I did, lived through the Vietnam War, which killed millions of people in the name of protecting Vietnamese independence. And one more, the big thing here really is something that Amy Goodman pointed out on Democracy Now!, and I'm quoting from her here. We have found it almost impossible to imagine 30 years after the end of the Cold War that there could be a nuclear war between the United States and Russia, but the crisis in Ukraine is putting exactly that possibility on the table again. So I think the short-term prognosis for genuine Ukrainian independence is not good at all, but there is a hopeful sign in reports of a considerable amount of resistance to Putin's war plans inside Russia itself. So I think the best thing that the American anti-war movement can do now is to declare our solidarity with the Russian anti-war movement, and at the same time oppose our government's current saber rattling.
Okay, Chippy? Chippy?
Okay,
Yes.
Harold, I'm recognizing you. I don't know where you are, but you had an announcement you wanted to make.
Oh,
Yeah, in past sessions, many of us have, or at least a few of us have gone out for lunch,
Chippy.
typically around 12:15, 12:30. Once we've gone to the old Florida Cafe, which is in Century Village, right next to the swimming pool, or the Bagel Center on 18th Street. If any of you would like to get together, whether to discuss today's things or just anything at all, it's a friendly group. Sometimes we've had as many as 20 odd people. Other times just 2 people showed up, but it's always been a lot of fun. So probably the best way, you have the chat, just send a chat to me or just make it to everybody and say, yeah, you'd like to go for lunch. we can try to get a phone for a reservation. Let's say I know here in Century Village at the Old Florida Cafe, so we don't have to wait. But I'd like to know in advance, would anybody like to go? And just send me a chat, please.
Linda? Linda, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you so much for allowing us all to come. I'm attending from Chicago, and that was a wonderful talk. The question I was going to originally ask is among the excellent questions that have already been posed in the chat. So I just, Richard, want to let the moderator know that there are some people asking questions in the chat as well. So I'll ask this. I worked for several years at a public university in Chicago, where STEM programs were an important source of new opportunities for study with a lot of future job potential, including for many students of color. So I would like to ask Cliff, would you advise such students, once they go through these various STEM programs in engineering and science and math, to try to avoid taking jobs that are related to the military industrial complex, which is, after all, as your talk pointed out and the book does, many jobs, or how they should approach that? And for those that are already in such jobs as engineers, scientists, or technicians, should they quit such jobs, or what should their posture be? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. I won't advise, should I go ahead, Richard?
Yes.
I won't advise students who aspire to be scientists or engineers one way or the other, but I will say that they should not be under the illusion that they'll be able to carve out a career of public service in science, because the need for funding will determine that most of their talents will be directed to the cause of corporate profits and war. And that is an unfortunate fact of our current situation. As for whether scientists, engineers, and tech workers who work for the military industrial complex now should quit their jobs and seek other jobs, first of all, it's not likely that many of them will find jobs elsewhere. The immense military funding for science and technology is a powerful inducement that makes following your conscience very, very expensive. My own first job out of engineering school was with the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. They were making C-130s and C-141s for the Vietnam War. And I became so completely opposed to that war that I did quit my job with Lockheed. I did it publicly. I made a big public stink about it. And because of that, I couldn't get another job. Everywhere I'd go to look for a job, the FBI had been there before me. I found that out later when I got my FBI papers through the Freedom of Information Act. Anyway, I never regretted quitting the job at Lockheed, but it took me almost a year to find another job that paid less than half what I had been making at Lockheed. So I speak from experience. And if a young scientist or engineer came to me and asked me if they should do what I did, I'd say, no, not necessarily. But if they decided that for ethical or moral reasons, they just couldn't keep doing what they were doing, and they're prepared to make that necessary material sacrifice, I certainly wouldn't discourage them from doing so. I would point out, though, that their individual sacrifice would have very little impact on the military industrial complex. But if they could participate in organizing a movement of scientists and engineers to resist military funding, as was once done with Reagan's Star Wars project. It didn't succeed in stopping the Star Wars project, but it was a very impressive sign of what can happen when scientists and engineers decide they don't want to do something like that. And to anybody who wants to take a step in the idea of organizing a movement of scientists and engineers to resist military funding, I would recommend that they join an organization or at least read the magazine of an organization that I belong to called Science for the People. Can you see that? That's a copy of the magazine, Science for the People. And they have a website, scienceforthepeople.org. So that's my recommendation.
First, let me say that those people who have sent in chats, I think we would far prefer to see you actually talking than to have somebody read off your question in a chat. So if you have questions that you want to repeat that you sent in on a chat, just raise your hand. Now, Mark, you're next. Mark? What's happening? His screen, his audio went black. He doesn't know how to unmute himself. Ask on.
How's that?
That's good, better.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, great. I said I listened in from New York. It was a great talk. Thank you. You mentioned weaponized Keynesianism in the context of military spending. What is that? And what does it have to do with the tragedy of American science?
Okay, thanks for that question. I didn't want to take up the time of the presentation to go into it because it's complicated, but it is one of the key points in the book. Weaponized Keynesianism is also sometimes called military Keynesianism. And what it is a theoretical explanation for why the American economy is so extremely dependent on military spending, why the United States devotes an absurd proportion of the national wealth to weapons and wars, and why the military budget keeps growing year in and year out. Here's what it boils down to. Without the more than $1 trillion a year in military spending, the American economy would very rapidly collapse into permanent paralysis, as during the Great Depression. It's a plausible explanation. It's derived from the observation that it took unprecedented massive military expenditures to end the Great Depression of the 1930s, which had immobilized the American economy for years. As economist Paul Krugman explains, it was, I'm quoting him, the large public works program, otherwise known as World War II, that ended the Great Depression. If the United States today, if the Pentagon today stopped providing a gigantic artificial market for industrial production, millions of workers, and not only workers in weapons plants, would lose their livelihoods. Without paychecks, they wouldn't be able to buy goods or services, and the wheels of the national economy would grind to a halt. And because of that, then the global economy would also collapse. So what has this got to do with science? Military research only accounts for a fraction of the trillions of dollars in war spending. Although that's true, it's the R&D money spent on creating high-tech weaponry that's at the base of the whole process. It's the science and technology that creates the weapons that the military budget spends trillions of our tax dollars on. The significance of the idea of weaponized Keynesianism is that it exposes the unavoidable destructiveness of our current economic system. If massive, uncontrollable war spending is an essential feature of our economic system, then the only way America's forever wars can be ended is to fundamentally change the economic system. And I think that's perhaps the most powerful of all arguments in favor of socialism. Now that's the short answer to your question. There's more to weaponized Keynesianism than that, but if you want to pursue the issue further, I urge you to read the book.
Okay, Hal? Hal, you're up.
So my question is, Bill and Melinda Gates bragged that they have done a lot of things in investing to eliminate disease in the third world, and to a certain extent have succeeded in doing some of those things. So what is your answer to that?
Okay, another excellent question. And I talk about that quite a bit in the book, but I'll try to give you a quick answer. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a prime example of what has been called philanthrocapitalism. The Gates Foundation, has, as you said, has been funding scientific projects all over the world for a number of years. But how has it worked out? First of all, we have to acknowledge, no matter what we think of the Gateses, that their money has in fact helped a lot of poor people in a lot of poor countries. I'll give you one good example. They invested $200 million to provide people in various parts of the world with something most of us Americans take for granted, and that's sanitary toilets. More than half of the world's population, 4.5 billion people, according to UNICEF, don't have access to sanitary toilets. And infections caused by poor sanitation results in the deaths by diarrhea of an estimated 500,000 children every year. So that's a good thing that the Gates money did. However, the problem is this: why do sanitary toilets need to be funded by very wealthy private individuals like Bill and Melinda Gates? In any rational world, sanitary toilets would be publicly funded. The charitable foundations provide things that negligent governments of rich and poor countries alike fail to provide. And like all charity, it doesn't address root causes. The endemic health crisis of the third world stems from its poverty. The Gates Foundation's endowment, the last time I checked, was more than $50 billion. And they don't keep that $50 billion in a vault in the form of cash. They invest it. And a huge proportion of its investment portfolio is in big pharma. So in the final analysis, the Gates Foundation, in conjunction with big pharma, perpetuates and exacerbates global economic inequality. I can give you a specific example of how that works. A few years ago, the Gates Foundation put up $4 billion to extend reproductive health care access to women in poor countries. The idea was to help some of the world's poorest women escape the cycle of constant childbearing and child raising. Again, that's a good thing. But what they did, they gave the $4 billion to the Pfizer Corporation for research that resulted in a new birth control pill called Depo-Provera. Those contraceptive pills were given away at first, but eventually the women taking them would have to pay for them. That was expected to create a market for Depo-Provera that would bring Pfizer $15 to $35 billion a year in sales. That's a pretty good return on investment. $4 billion invested in research brings you $15 to $35 billion a year in sales. And guess what? The Gates Foundation's investment portfolio includes a large stake in the Pfizer Corporation. So you do the math. The Gates Foundation's $4 billion grant to Pfizer expands the company's markets enormously. That brings Pfizer windfall profits. And that means the value of the Gates Foundation's Pfizer stock goes up, and that increases Bill and Melinda Gates' already outsized share of the world's economic resources. So that is philanthrocapitalism in a nutshell. I said that the Gates Foundation perpetuates and exacerbates global economic inequality, and that's how they do it.
Hey, Phyllis Kittler.
Great talk, Cliff. I especially appreciated the graphics. Terrific book. I was interested in whether you had something to say about how corporatized science has particularly had negative effects on women as a group, and maybe women of color.
I'll just have to, thank you for that question. I just have to say that when it comes to women's history, the history of science, I'm sorry to say, is a lot like military history. In the current movement to tear down statues of generals, the generals have been 100% male. Official science has likewise been mostly an androcentric affair. And that's been a major factor in the tragedy, not only of American science, but of contemporary science in general. And although official science has been an androcentric affair, unofficial science has historically been another matter altogether, which I discussed in an earlier book, if people can see that, a history, People's History of Science. But in the current book that we're talking about, The Tragedy of American Science, I've had to concentrate mainly on the negative aspects of American science from Truman to Trump, which is to say from the end of World War II to the present. The general exclusion of women from scientific policy-making positions has been a systemic problem. So when I've examined the institutional roots of the tragedy in institutions like the RAND Corporation and DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and JASON, I haven't come upon very many women at all. But that's not to say that women haven't had a role to play in this history and in this book in particular. I dedicate the book to investigative journalists and public interest advocates, among others, who provided a lot of the research material for the book, and a lot of them are women. Their contributions, however, have been recorded more in the source notes to the book than in the text. Just for a few examples, I drew on the work of investigative journalists Annie Jacobson and Jane Meyer, as well as authors like Naomi Oreskes, Marcia Angel, Marion Nestle, and Naomi Klein. Annie Jacobs' brilliant reporting on DARPA and Operation Paperclip was of particular value to me in writing this book. As for the impact of the tragedy of science on women in particular, I would say probably that would have to, you'd have to point to the medical sciences for that, which have been detrimental to women's health for centuries. In recent years, there's been more consciousness of the problem, but there hasn't been a lot of genuine progress because science continues to be motivated by corporate profit rather than human needs. I hope that answers the question, or begins to at least.
Barbara Mutnick, are you still here? I guess not.
Maybe she's not muted, or maybe she's still muted.
She's still muted. I can tell that. Barbara?
Okay, hi, I'm unmuted. I wanted to thank the forum, which I've been to numerous times when I've been in Florida. It's a wonderful forum. And Cliff Connor for his wonderful talk. I was wondering if you have anything to say about cryptocurrencies and blockchain, which have so interested, especially young people seem very interested in this. And, you know, what do you as a progressive scientist have to say, historian of science have to say about these?
I didn't mention Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies at all in the original publication of the book. So if you want to see what I have to say about them in print, you'll have to order the new edition, the paperback edition that's coming out in June. But I can tell you now in brief that it's almost an understatement to say there's interest in it. Unfortunately, there's become a widespread cult of crypto. And if you watched the Super Bowl and saw all the ads for cryptocurrencies, you probably were aware of that. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and their underlying blockchain technology are tech innovations, as I said, that I didn't discuss in the original book, but recent experience has confirmed early worries that they are a very, very bad idea indeed. Most disturbing is the outrageously large carbon footprint that accompanies their production. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are, in quotes, mined by entire warehouses full of constantly running specialized computers. The cooling power to keep those computers from overheating consumes an inordinate amount of energy, mostly in the form of coal-generated electricity. A BBC report a year ago revealed that Bitcoin production uses more electricity per year than the entire country of Argentina consumes. And that number is growing continuously with no end in sight. So what we have to ask ourselves is, what value does this unconscionable expenditure of energy produce? Bitcoin has no intrinsic material value. You often hear people say that the material value of a dollar bill puts it at no more than the paper it's printed on. Well, Bitcoin isn't even printed on paper, so its material value is even less. Meanwhile, the price of a single Bitcoin has explosively inflated, rising from essentially zero at its inception in 2009 to tens of thousands of dollars today. That price is determined by buyers bidding for them in a manipulated market. It's analogous to the international art market, in which a painting merely thought to be by Leonardo da Vinci can sell for $450 million. And all for what? Bitcoin's only use value is as a currency that is crypto, which is to say hidden from public accountability. Most news reports have focused on Bitcoin holders' most unsavory motives for hiding money, such as to finance illegal drug dealing or to collect ransomware payments. But the essential motivation driving cryptocurrency is old-fashioned tax evasion. The libertarians' fever dreams of freeing currency from the clutches of tyrannical government are just cover for the desire to hide their wealth from the tax authorities. As facilitators of ever-growing global economic inequality, cryptocurrencies are in their very essence opposed to the public interest. Meanwhile, there's an even darker underside to the crypto story. Aside from its use as a money laundering and asset hiding medium, it is luring gullible small investors into a gigantic decentralized Ponzi scheme. As one astute critic explains, cryptocurrency is the people's Ponzi. Unlike Bernie Madoff's fraudulent scheme, which swindled wealthy investors, when crypto crashes, everyday working people will suffer most when their savings inevitably disappear. I'll say one more thing on this subject, and that is that the blockchain algorithm on which Bitcoin runs is an ingenious technological innovation. It has proven to be useful, for example, in rural China, where it gives consumers a trustworthy means of assuring food safety that the Chinese government is unable to provide. Sadly, however, whatever potential blockchain has to improve the human condition is currently being grossly misused in a way that threatens humanity's very existence.
Harold?
Yeah, okay. First of all, I did enjoy the talk, but I don't particularly say that I will agree with everything 100%. And I'd like to get your comments, but it'll take a bit of a preamble. You imply that everything is black and white, or it's a yes or no, or do or don't do, like socialism versus capitalism, military or pacifism. There has to be a large gray area where you have to find a balance somewhere, where any country, any industry, any area that'll best serve the people. And just for example, if there was no NATO, Russia would have invaded Ukraine probably years earlier, because you have to have some ability to defend yourself. I mean, taking
Can you phrase this as a question, Harold?
Well, I'm gonna ask his comments on this. I mean, sure, it's a bit of a mild debate, but I'm gonna give you one quote from Benjamin Netanyahu. I know you had a sign, and
You
it's
have
posted in
to
the
ask the
background.
question.
Okay. Do you not think that there is a place for military investments, and just to strike a balance? Where should you stop, or where should government invest in, even in pharmaceuticals, as opposed to leaving it to the private? There is somewhere a happy medium. How do you define that happy medium?
Okay, thank you, Harold, for the thoughtful question. I can possibly see why you think I'm speaking in black and white terms, but I don't really think in those terms, and I'll try to explain some of this to you. But let me say one thing about the NATO. Do we need NATO to protect us from Russia? Well, maybe we do today, but we wouldn't have if the Cold War hadn't turned Russia into our bitter enemy. If we hadn't, by now, the world could have solved all of its problems diplomatically if it weren't for the drive of the Cold Warriors to demonize the Soviet Union, which was not a Soviet threat. There was no Soviet threat. It was made up because the Soviet Union didn't want to have war with the United States. So the premise that without NATO today, we would be helpless at the hands of Russia presupposes 75 years of Cold War that shouldn't have happened in the first place if we had a rational response after World War II to creating a peaceful world. Now, in terms of the black and white thing with the military investment, I have to tell you that in our current system, if I could vote, if I could control the congressional and vote on the military budget, my figure would be 0. No military budget. But of course, we live in a world that, you know, we've been handed a military world in which we have enemies, which we shouldn't have, but we do because of the way the world economy has been developed. So to avoid the black and white thing of saying, well, today we have to have a 0 military budget. Today we must have socialism and get rid of capitalism. I know that's not possible, but so let me take the question a different way and say, is there a way that the tragedy of American science, together with all of the tragedies of our social problems, can they be resolved without saying socialism now, immediately? And we have to do that. We have to find a way to get from here to there. We're in an economy that is dooming us to climate or nuclear destruction or any number of ways will be. So we have to find a way to get away from the current economic system to a new system that's better and doesn't do all of these terrible things. So I want to give a few specific, concrete suggestions as to the first steps in that direction. When it comes to the way science is practiced, a better world is definitely possible. And to get there, the first steps are to nationalize big pharma, nationalize the fossil fuel industry, nationalize the banks, nationalize the insurance companies, and nationalize the military contractors. But for any of that to happen and for it to have any meaning, the nationalized economy has to be administered by a government that's democratically controlled by the people of this country, rather than by a tiny super wealthy elite. So the crucial step is a fundamental political change that creates the power and the will to carry out the nationalizations I outlined. Now, I know that in today's world, that sounds very unlikely, but we got to find a way to do it. And if you look at history, you find that unlikely things tend to happen very rapidly when the heat goes on. I'm personally, another of my historical interests is in the French Revolution. So I'm very aware of how that historical process can work. And it always comes out of nowhere. Today we're not expecting it. Tomorrow it'll be on the agenda. And I'm saying that's some steps that can be taken in the direction to solve our tragedy of science and our general tragedy of our entire social lives.
Cliff, you and I probably agree on the principles. We will disagree on the details, I'm sure, if we ever got into it, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, John, you're up.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it's worth recalling that there was a time when socialists, as a matter of principle, opposed voting for military appropriations. It's interesting to consider why they had that view and why it was given up. But my question is rather different. Cliff, you have spoken of American science and science in general. And I'm wondering if you would care to compare these two terms in this sense. Do the illnesses that beset science in the United States play out in a similar way in other major capitalist countries? Thank you.
John, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Could you say that, just the question part, one more time?
Okay. Do the illnesses that you describe with respect to science in the United States play out in similar fashion in other major capitalist countries?
Yes, definitely. Although the United States has a special role in the world economy, obviously, largely tied to its military role, of course. I tried to make clear that the title, the word American in the title doesn't mean that I'm restricting the tragedy to the United States alone. The United States plays a major role in driving it, but the corporatization of science and to one degree or another, the militarization of science is a problem in most of the capitalist world. So,
Oh, sorry. Go on.
if you read the book as a and just take the word American out of the title as you're reading it, that's fine.
Frank?
Yeah, just a little background. My daughter is an engineer, ceramic engineer, and she. It's not me. Somebody's off the mute. Sorry, I can just hear them talking. Anyway, she worked in New Zealand for quite a while. In New Zealand, the country government controls all the science, and she essentially worked for the government for the good of the people. Back in the United States, she teaches at a university. My question is, that's a little bit of background. Cliff, she has a contract with NASA. And before you said that NASA is just part of the military industrial complex. Is NASA trying to do some good, or just trying to develop science, plant the flag on the moon and Mars as part of the whole warlike attitude? Question. Did you hear me, Cliff?
I think you're asked, to tell you the truth, I was having a hard time hearing you. Maybe somebody else could repeat the question, or?
How about now? Is this better?
Well,
is this better?
You're talking about space, the space program.
Yeah, NASA. Right? NASA. Yeah. How you feel about NASA?
Okay.
That's really my question.
I'm just going to say that the whole thing about the Space Force, the space program, and Trump's Space Force in particular, and all of that, it goes way back. It's kind of a trick that's being played on us. We're all so very interested in learning what is beyond our planet, the moon, Mars, and beyond in outer space. And so we've been led to believe that NASA and the American space program, all the science that goes with it, is to help us understand what's going on in the universe. Because we're curious. I'd love to know. Every time NASA does something, I'm reading the news about it. But the trick is that it's what do they call it? And when you advertise something, a bait and switch. It's a bait and switch trick, where they promise us the moon and Mars and information about that we're interested in. But what the American space program and all of the tons of money that are spent on it it wasn't for our entertainment. It wasn't for to give us the knowledge that we wanted in that regard. It was to create this vast system of satellites so that the American military can control the whole world. It's very obvious recently when the Biden withdrew from all the troops from Afghanistan and said, well, we're ending the forever war. Well, that was a tricky formulation because people were talking about the forever wars, plural, and he says, I'm ending the forever war. But even that war, even the war in Afghanistan, he's not ending because he said that, don't worry, we can still watch the terrorists because we have over the horizon technical capability. And that over the horizon technical capability is based on billions and billions of dollars spent on the development of the satellite system. I want to recommend a book to people if you're interested in that subject. Most of you have heard of the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's become Mr. Science in the United States these days. He wrote an excellent book called Accessory to War, in which he said that the science of astrophysics is entirely dependent on the American quest for military dominance. And I'll quote him here. Space, he wrote, has been politicized and militarized from the opening moments of the race to reach it. And that's what you have to understand is all of the great civilian technologies we have, like GPS, for example. GPS wasn't designed to allow us to drive around the back roads and know where we are by having a map on our computer screens in the car. GPS was designed to allow the military to control its rockets and missiles and aircraft all over the world. And so they have weaponized space in order to do that. And that's the point that Neil deGrasse Tyson is making in that book, Accessory to War. It actually began with, I'm having a hard time with names here. The first head of NASA was a German physicist who had come to the United States through Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was what allowed 1,600 Nazi scientists to avoid prosecution as war criminals and come here to the United States. So our whole space program was developed by the people who developed the Nazi rockets that bombed Britain. Those were the first ICBMs.
Is that Werner von Braun?
Say what?
Von Braun?
Oh, Werner von Braun. Yes, thank you. That's the name that was escaping me. He was the first head of NASA, and he was the biggest promoter of civilian space travel to make us think that it was all for our edification. But it wasn't. It was entirely a military project from the word go. And if you have any questions about that, I refer you to Neil deGrasse Tyson's book, Accessory to War.
Chippy?
Yes, thank you very much, Cliff. I really I appreciate so much your depth of knowledge in this, and to be able to hear from you and that you share it. Particularly of interest to me was suggestions that you gave of things that learning more and more about this or knowing about it already, actual concrete suggestions, which we don't always hear from a speaker on a specific topic. So I'm very grateful for that piece also. And I have a question that's off topic, but things happen so quickly this week. I have always considered myself a progressive, and beginning with the anti-war movement in the 60s. But what's happened in the last week has shaken just the way I think or thoughts, because it was or wasn't predictable, or I can't believe that people are doing this. I feel that what's happening in Ukraine disrupts all of my usual logical thinking patterns. And that's very terrifying to me. So I'm reaching out to you as someone who I think is savvy and studious and in great depth in history, fellow Francophile. But could you please comment on that? It's about fear and about saying, how could somebody do that? But they are. So now what else will they do? It's unpredictable and almost, and reminds me also of Trump and the sense of unpredictability. Could you, I'd like to know how you see that, and whatever you have to say about it, but thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. And I can definitely empathize, because it is very upsetting. As I mentioned, Amy Goodman had said, we're back in the period of imminent danger of the world blowing up because of nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And I don't know how to solve that fear. You know, that's the sad thing is I felt bad in a way about publishing this book because it's so negative. I do say that it's not an impossible situation. We as a human race could solve this, but it's gotten to the point now that we're right on the precipice again of a possible nuclear war. And that is frightening. And I don't know how, we are individually powerless to stop it, but I'm hoping that people will understand that a great deal of this, what we're seeing as Russian aggression is, there's two sides to the story. I mean, nobody should trust Putin for one word that he says, obviously. But what we're not told quite often is, for example, for the last few years, the United States has been building an advanced nuclear missile base 100 miles from the Russian border. And the Russians, not only Putin, but most Russians are aware of this. It's in Poland. And they're afraid of it. And so the first thing we see is Putin putting troops around the Ukraine and invading the Ukraine. But there's been a prehistory to this where the United States could have gone in many different ways to head this off, and they didn't. The main thing I'm hoping is that we will continue to study and get these ideas out. It's not a greatly hopeful prospect, but I think the first thing we have to understand is that we can't be blind patriots thinking that we have to support American militarism against Russian militarism. We have to somehow get to a point where we understand that all of this saber rattling and provoking is not in our interest. And our military is the dominant military on the planet, far more powerful than the Russian military. But the Chinese military is even more. That's the real question is whether there's going to be an all-out war at some point between China and the United States. And I can only presume that Biden's strategy is to just blunder through and try to intimidate the Soviet Union from withdrawing from the Ukraine or whatever. But somehow I think that's not a good strategy. So to answer your question, Chippy, I don't have an answer for how we can control our fear. We just have to keep organizing an anti-war movement in this country, supporting the anti-war movement in Russia right now, and if need be in China when that comes around.